Okay, now this MIDI hack is one of my personal favorites. I don't know about you guys, but I like to use the MIDI effects that come stock with Ableton Live quite a bit. It's a great way to kind of spice up MIDI performances and maybe get some new ideas for melodies and arpeggiators and things like that going, or arpeggios, I should say. So anyway, for this example, I've loaded up a pretty basic operator patch I put together. It's got kind of a 80s Juno kind of pad sound. And I've added a couple of MIDI effects to the chain here. Remember, the MIDI effects can be found in your browser under the MIDI effects category, and we've got a whole slew of them right here. I'm using the chord and the arpeggiator MIDI effect. Now let's turn these on. And what this is going to allow me to do is hold a single note down and then get a nice little arpeggiated performance going on there. So if I were to record the MIDI right now, let me show you what would happen. So let's hit the record button up here. So as I play in, this one note at a time, you see that literally just that one note at a time that I held is just being shown in the MIDI clip. And wouldn't it be nice if I was able to see all of the MIDI that is being generated by these awesome MIDI effects here, and then maybe I could take that MIDI performance and use it to trigger the synth, and then maybe go in and edit it and make some fine-tuning adjustments to it. So the answer is yes, there is a way to see all of the MIDI that has come out of the MIDI effects. And the way we need to do that is to re-record the MIDI onto a new MIDI track. So let's create a new MIDI track. Remember, Shift-Command-T on the Mac is the key command for that. Shift-Control-T on the PC. And with the new MIDI track, we'll need to go over here to the routing section, the inputs and outputs. If you're not seeing that, remember this I/O button will show and hide that for you. And I want to tell this new MIDI track, and let's maybe call this re-record. Let's spell that right. Re-recorded MIDI. Sure. And we'll extend it out so we can just see the full name there. And let's now set the input of this track to the track that I have the synth ARP on. So we're going to go here, select the synth ARP track. And this is really important. We want to make sure that we select the input post FX, meaning after the MIDI effects. If we choose pre-effects, we're just going to get the one note at a time that I played up here. So we want to choose post FX for this. And we're also going to need to record arm this track. Now, because I've already played in a little performance here, that's just going to trigger and play back for us when I hit play. And then as these notes pass through the MIDI effects, the output of that is going to be resampled or re-recorded onto this MIDI track down here, the re-recorded MIDI track. So this should work for us. Let's make sure everything's set. We've got the record arm on. Let's hit record and see what happens. Perfect. And as you can see, we've got all these arpeggiated MIDI notes showing up here. Great, so let's stop the recording. Let's go into the MIDI clip now, double click on it, and now we can see all of those beautifully arpeggiated MIDI notes. We're now free to go down here, make edits to the MIDI notes, what have you. And if we want to now use this MIDI clip to trigger our synth that we've got on the first track, let's go back here and delete the original MIDI track where we played in one note at a time. Just move this one up to that MIDI track. Now this is important. We need to actually go back to the device view on this first MIDI track. Remember, you can do that by pressing the Shift-Tab key command. And we'll need to turn these MIDI effects off. If we leave them on, each of these MIDI notes is going to trigger a chord and then get arpeggiated, and it's going to sound kind of weird. So once you've got the MIDI re-recorded from your MIDI effects, just make sure you go back to the track that you're using the MIDI clip on and you turn those MIDI effects off. Now it should play back as we heard it recorded. Fantastic. And bear in mind here that this will work with any of the MIDI effects that come with Ableton Live. This will also work with MIDI effects that are third-party plugins, for example, X for Records, Cthulhu, and things like that, that affect the MIDI in different ways. You can use this technique with any sort of external MIDI effect as well. So again, a helpful one for seeing the MIDI notes that are being output by MIDI effects, And like I said, this is a great way to come up with just new melodic ideas, slap a couple of MIDI effects on, see what the output is, and then maybe go in there and make some edits to it if need be.